Hello and welcome to my latest video. So in this video I'm going to be continuing painting Fulgrim, and what I'm going to be doing is splitting up the Fulgrim videos a little bit more so that you can find exactly which video you want for a specific tutorial. So in this video I'm going to be painting the gold wing coming off of his chest there, and then the next video, which I'm doing straight after this, is going to be the green gem that's going to be right in the middle of his chest. So hopefully it'll just be a little bit easier for people to find exactly what they want for specific tutorials. So for the wing, it's going to be painted obviously very similar to the other non-metallic gold that's on the model, so you can see I'd already painted in around his collar. I didn't actually record around the collar because I wanted to test myself just to see how it was going to look, because the thing with Fulgrim is he's quite a large model and he seems like he should be easy to paint, but the details on him are very I don't know, they're a little bit strange. They're very, very detailed, and there's not really a lot of flat, clean surface to work on. So even like what should be a simple curve, there's more kind of like little facets and undulations going on the lines. Nothing's very clean or clear on any part of the model, really. You're always having to just paint it a little bit differently than what you might imagine. So I wanted to test out the colours, so I thought I'd paint in the collar first and then I'd show you how those colours work on the wing. And also in other videos I'm going to obviously be doing like the shoulders and things like that. So I mean, there's going to be plenty of opportunity to see how to do the thinner kind of trim on other parts of the model, but like I said, I wanted to test it out first. So for the colours, the first thing I'm doing is painting the whole of the wing with Mournfang brown. You don't have to get a perfect coat for this. It doesn't have to be completely solid or opaque or anything like that. What you probably will find though is while you're painting, you can see just where like the tips of the feathers on the wings. So they're not actually feathers. I went and checked the box art on these, and they're like little claws coming out of the end. And on the box art, they actually paint them as black, like fingernails or something. But what you'll probably have to do is go back in and clean them up a little bit. So I found while I was doing it that I had to go, actually while I'm painting, I had to go back in with a scalpel and cut off some of the little bumps and bits. And you can see, some of them aren't separated that cleanly. You're always going to get bits like that with resin anyway, but I mean, it's a bit of a pain to paint these kind of things on the models, because you don't have to deal with that when you're painting on plastic. I've mentioned it before, but it's very obvious where you have to clean something up with plastic. But with resin, you just find bits anywhere and everywhere that will need to be tweaked and cleaned up as you're going along, and quite often you're going to have to do it while you're painting. And a model of this size and complexity is just like a nightmare waiting to happen for all these little details. So the colours that I'm using, obviously I've already said with the Mournfang brown. Then I've mixed a lot of colours as well here. So I've got Mournfang brown mixed with XV88 on like at the bottom, second in from the left. Then to the left of that is just XV88. Then above that is Balor brown, and above that is Balor brown mixed with ice yellow. Then to the right of that, obviously ice yellow, and then to the right of that is white. I've also got some Troll Slayer orange, that's the darker of the oranges on there. And to the right of that I've got another orange. It's a Kimera colours yellow called Diarylide yellow. Now you don't need to use that. I've just been trying to test out some of the Kimera colour paints, and they seem quite fun to use. I'm not sure how easy they are for people to get there, so I'm not sure if I'll put them into my regular use, but just for me, I'm enjoying using them. But if you do want to use it, it's kind of like a Fire Dragon Bright, but with a bit more yellow and red added, so it's a bit more saturated, but it's lighter than Troll Slayer anyway. And I'm just using that for highlighting the orange reflections in the bounce highlights, and that's not really that much of an issue anyway on the wing, because there aren't that many bounce highlights on it. But I will be using it in other parts of the model, as I explained earlier, various parts of trim and things, where the bounce highlights, especially in the shadows, where I want to paint highlights on bounce highlights that are going to be a little bit duller, and that'll just give me the opportunity to make it pop a bit more. But I'll talk about that when we actually do those in the other videos. So looking at what I've been doing on the wing here, I've just been sort of like blocking in the light placement at the moment. The wing is a little bit trickier to paint in non-metallic than I first anticipated. And part of the reason for that is that it has kind of an S shape going on. So where normally a wing would curve in at the point where it's got, I guess it would be the elbow point on the wing. From the little pointy part anyway, on the left there, that's where it usually would curve in at the deepest, and it would then come out closer in like a curve where the tips of the wings would be closer really to you than the concave part of the wing. But in this case it doesn't do that at all, and that's actually much further forward, and then it curves towards you a little bit, then it curves backwards away from you, and then it again curves back towards you again. So it's got a bit of an undulation, a bit of an S shape going on. And I mean, usually S shapes and things are easier to paint, and to be fair, it is sort of easier to do that because it gives you nice light volumes to play with, and it makes it a bit more obvious on how to size and shape the light volumes. But because of that sort of like that shape, that you have to add additional reflections on there. So for a start off, what I was going to do is I was going to like paint a very strong shiny bright section on the curve forwards, and then I was going to make it go darker as it curves away from you, which is kind of how it looks at the end. But you can't just leave it dark in the curve away because it just looks unpainted. And I mean, I think I could have painted it so it would look good in the video or on a social media post, but in reality it would just be Mournfang brown as a flat colour, and that looks sort of rubbish when you look at it in the flesh. It's very clearly just a flat colour. But it is true also that as I paint more of the model, I'm going to need to paint elements of non-metallic gold that are in shadow and not shiny, and I need to do something to those to make them interesting and not look like they're just flat colours. And it's something that's very specific to the model painting, because it's something that when you see the model in the flesh, whereas if you do a 2D painting, you can kind of get away with leaving a flat block colour, and it looks, it'll look good because for the same reason that this would look good, or I could make it look good in a social media post. A social media post is a 2D art piece, kind of separate from the model itself. But when you see it, in reality, and you turn it around and the lighting doesn't move or anything like that, it just looks bad. So especially because you spend a lot of time highlighting on the bright shiny parts, and it's very obvious in comparison that you've spent a lot of time highlighting the shiny parts and then you've done nothing to the dark parts. So I had to go back into the darker areas and put like darker reflections in there. And what I mean by darker reflections is, I don't mean they're like darker than the Mournfang brown, although you can add darker reflections than the Mournfang brown if you want. So if it's like a sort of like a black object that you want to reflect in there, then you can go darker. And I've got some Rhinox hide on the wet palette, although I don't use it in this video because I decided that the dark parts on the wing, I don't want to be that dark, because there's going to be parts that are in more shadow that I need to be able to go darker than Mournfang brown later on. So that will then just kind of muddy it up a bit. I might still go back and tweak it. So we'll see how it all goes. And again, all these things will be covered in videos as I go along, because it is a very complicated model. But what I mean by the darker highlights is basically they're the same highlights I'm doing now, and they're just not highlighted up to the same standard. The same brightness as the very bright highlight points. So you have a range of highlights, a range of brightnesses on different reflections along the wing, on the feathers, and the trick is to just not highlight everything up to white. And it's always, I've gone over this before, but the temptation always when you're painting things like this is to paint everything up to the same brightness, because you feel like you haven't painted it enough, like you haven't done the whole process. Especially in this case, it becomes extra tricky, because when you pick the brightest parts to highlight and you highlight it up and you go through and you get like this, the final white highlight, and suddenly it comes to life with that bright shiny bling element there, and it's all nicely blended and nice light volumes, and you think, well, that's brought it to life. I now need to do that to every other part of it, because that clearly works, and that's how it, that will make it look better. And it actually makes it look worse. It takes away the non-metallic look to it, because you need parts that are shiny and parts that aren't shiny to make the shiny parts look shiny. If everything's shiny, then nothing's shiny, and then his head falls off. So but you have to kind of like force yourself to leave things darker. I mean, you can still spend a lot of time on them, blending them, making them look good, but you just make sure that you don't take them to a lighter stage than they need to be. The other thing is, there's a couple of things really, but one thing that you're going to find as you go through the highlights, so we're up to Balor Brown mixed with Ice Yellow now on the highlights. So I've just been going over, shrinking the highlight a little bit each time, so you can see a bit of the colour at the edges. But these layers that I paint on, they're quite opaque each time, which will then make the subsequent highlight layer easier to go on, because it's it's a lighter colour each time that you're painting on top of a quite light colour already. So it'll just it'll cover a bit better, but also it looks better as a metallic thing. Like it looks a very strong, clean light reflecting on it. Whereas if you have a lot of translucency on something when you're painting it non-metallic, it doesn't look as good, basically. It's I mean, you can get different types of non-metallics, but in this case I want the shine to be very clear and very strong, and that will come across with a very opaque finish. And it's especially important when you get up to the very brightest highlights. So when we're up to the ice yellow, that has to be super opaque, because otherwise it won't look like a bright shiny object. It'll look kind of a bit dirty, because you'll see some of the lower layer colours coming through. You can see as well, I'm using like a larger brush here, so it's a bit of a funny, like, sort of flat, chunky brush. You don't need to use that, but if you go for something that's like a size 1 or a size 2, because it's quite a large-ish wing anyway, you just need to block in the colours. The refinement stage is actually quite easy, and you do that later. I mean, it's easy, but it takes a long time, but there's not a lot to it. You just make sure that all the colours are very clean and crisp, and like just softened at the edges of the transitions. I will do more videos looking at those specific kind of types of blending movements, but I mean, I've done it so many times in the videos that hopefully you've got a good idea of that. But it's going to be more important, I suppose, for something like this, which will be a Golden Demon entry. But the light placement and the light volumes are more important to get right on this. So it's better to just block them in, and then the refinement can come later, because the refinement can take as long as you want it to, and you can spend hours and hours on an element of refinement, and then you can hardly tell the difference. But I mean, the judges will be able to tell the difference, but generally speaking, especially in social media posts, you won't be able to tell the difference for that level of refinement. But I did mention there were multiple things that were going on here, and you can see a little bit here actually what I'm doing now. So I've gone back, so I highlighted it up to the just about ice yellow colour on the brightest parts. But what happens is, the higher that you take these highlights, the more it takes away the yellow colour. So when you've got the highlights on, you then go back, use some of the Balor Brown, because the Balor Brown is the primary source of yellow on the model. Now obviously there's elements of yellow in XV88 and Mournfang Brown and Ice Yellow. I mean, clearly Ice Yellow's got it in the name, but the Balor Brown has more yellow than any of the other colours. And especially in this case, because it's gone up to Ice Yellow for the highlight, when you then go back with the Balor Brown and go over it, because it's a lighter colour underneath and it's a translucent layer as you apply it, the Balor Brown will look more yellow in that situation. Whereas if you put the Balor Brown on top of the Mournfang Brown, or whatever, the XV88, it doesn't look quite as yellow. But because it's a pale colour underneath, it allows the yellow to become more visible. So depending on which order you use paints in, you get different colours due to the translucency, which is something that I always find interesting when people ask me what my recipe is for painting gold. And I can give you the paint colours, but unless I give you the tutorial on how I actually apply the paint colours and in what order and what mixes and things, you won't get the same results. So also, so not just to do with the layers of paint and the opacity and the translucency of things, you know, you get different colors, but also when I've blocked in the colors and I've gone up to the brightest highlights and, you know, maybe taking it up to white or whatever, I can then still go back with the other colors and blend them in at the edges of the transition. So normally what's happened is I've painted in the highlights going through, you know, basically from dark to light, making the light volume slightly smaller each time, but still quite a big block. And then you've got, like, you can see the various different layers at the very edges of the transition, but they might not be perfect, you know, because they're quite big blocks of color, and you know, might not have been that careful applying them or whatever. But then you can go back. So I'm now using a smaller brush as well. And at those transitions, you can go back and you can use all the colours that you have mixed on your wet palette just to blend them in at the edges. And then you can focus on that to make sure that you get some of the yellow at the edges of these transitions. So again, going back in with the Balor Brown. Or depending on how high it is, you might not want to be using Balor Brown, but you can use the Balor Brown mixed with Ice Yellow. But whatever it is, just to get a bit more colour saturation back in there, because it will end up looking a bit sort of like caramel if you're not careful. I mean, you can sort of get around that a bit with, you know, just lots of nice reflections and light volumes, because in theory you should be able to paint these elements as non-metallic and make them look shiny even if they're in black and white. But to get the gold, you know, the actual sort of like the rich goldy kind of colour, you will want to make sure that it has the yellow at the edges of the transitions. So remember when I was talking about the darker area and the backwards curve of the wing here, originally I was going to leave this sort of darker, so then I'd have like a very high contrast shiny point on the small feathers on the, you know, the left hand side there, and then as they go to the larger feathers it would be very dark. So it would make the shine point really, really strong, and that would work quite nicely as a focal point right next to the face as well, so, you know, keeping your focus towards the head and sort of chest area. But I very quickly discovered that I'm not going to be able to get away with leaving that as a dark Mournfang brown flat area. I mean, I was pretty suspicious that I wouldn't be able to do that anyway. But what I ended up doing is I go back and I use the dark colours, so like the XV88, and block in some sort of very rough reflections. And I know people struggle with these kind of additional reflections because you can't use a guide of the lamp. You know, so there's the usual technique, putting the model under a lamp, seeing how the light hits it, and that gives you the primary light hitting it, the model, and you're like, okay, so I very clearly see how the light hits it, gives me a good indication of how the light volume, size and shape should be, and if I follow those I can make it look kind of shiny and metallic, which is true, but you don't get any of the bounce highlights in the, you don't get sort of the metallic element, and you don't get these random reflections that you have to use to fill in the space, because that sort of outer part of the wing, it just doesn't get any light hitting it really when you hold it under a lamp, depending on how I mean, you can tilt it, and that can actually be the brightest part of the wing, and the other parts to either side of it can be dark. So it is up to you how you hold it under the lamp to get the reflections that you want, but in this case, you know, I've got the reflections where I want them to be, and that then made the area to the right of that darker. And that's it. That's basically what the guide will be when you hold it under a lamp, is you get a dark area, and then you have to then do something with that, and that's what there's no sort of visual guide to give you all these little small reflections. Now, the reason I say small, you know, these little reflections, is because Fulgrim is a giant. So if you think of a space marine, he's supposed to be like, what, 7 feet tall or whatever it is, 7 or 8 feet tall, and like how much taller that is than, say, like a 6 foot person. That's huge. Like a 7 foot person walking around looks massive. Then you see a space marine compared to Fulgrim, and Fulgrim is just like humongous, like a massive creature, but he's still in the scale of like a normal human. So a space marine is already massive, and then you've got a little tiny human next to him, but the size of the reflections and everything should match the scale of the tiny human. He isn't like a human-sized snake person, he's a monster-sized snake person. So all the reflections need to be, well, some reflections will be big, but he should reflect the scale of the world around him. So you need to get some tiny little reflections in there. You can't just be like, oh, I'm just going to do a big blob of reflection. because what you'll end up with is the scale will look like a small, like if you're really not careful with actually how you put in some of these reflections, you can end up with something that looks like a highlighted toy. And I've seen this before when people have done non-metallics and reflections on things. You can alter the look of the scale of the model with the size and position of the reflections that you paint in, because they're purely using reflections from the lamp, and then because at the end of the day what the lamp is doing is highlighting a toy, like a small model, and those are the size and shape of the reflections that represents. So to get the scale correct, to make it look like a large model, like a large monster in the correct scale, you have to make the details extra small and tiny, and fit the scale that you want it to be. You did actually see me there, just as a side point, painting in some of the orange. So there are some like tiny little areas on this, and you can see just under the very large wing feather thing on the top, it has like a little chamfered edge, and that it's pretty visible. So I've painted that as a reflection, like a bounce reflection, orange right next to the shiny part on the tip of the inside feathers, because those are very bright, and then that will shine off of there onto those, and that should result in kind of like an orange reflection, kind of like actually on the inside of the collar there. The inside of the collar shouldn't really be orange because it's not reflecting off of another piece of gold, but I think it looks better having that sort of orangey look on the inside, because it is sort of like a reflection in a dark area. So I'm not going for realism in all parts of it. I need to make the model look good, and just having very dark unpainted areas can quite often be, it just looks like it's unpainted. But at the same time, I still need it to look like a darker area or a different color or a different sort of atmosphere to the brighter parts of the model. So I'm still using contrasts and focus and things like that, but I'm just adding additional detail in there. And so you can kind of see as I go along, and I'm like, I had the general idea on this as I went along for where to paint in the highlights, but as I go further and further along, I'm like, okay, this needs to be brighter, it still needs to be brighter, it needs to be brighter still. And you just kind of like, you can very quickly be like, oh, I've completely over highlighted the whole thing, and it's just like a very light sort of ice yellow looking wing now. So you still need to get these reflections in there, and then you might need to go back, knock back some of the highlights, but at the same time you still need the bright parts of it. And it's kind of something that you have to tweak as you go along, and that's also why I recommend that you don't go straight in with the size 00 brush. I mean I might have been tempted to just paint the whole thing with a size 00 anyway, and still do the refining at the end, but it's just a bit quicker if you're not as refined when you block in the primary highlights, and then as you start refining, you think, actually I need it to be lighter, so then I can start tweaking things using a smaller brush and refining, because it's just going to be a little bit quicker to get it done that way. And the other thing is, when you start using the smaller brush, it just becomes a little bit easier and more natural, I think, to paint in some of the additional reflections. So even on the shiny parts, so you see on these wings here, not wings, feathers, sorry, you can see as I've lightened up the top ones, I'm still having additional reflections in there. So when you hold this under a lamp, it'll just show you these feathers here, and it'll be one big block of highlight. But I'm doing little blocks of highlight with some more subtle, slightly darker reflections in there. So they're still very light in comparison to the dark parts of the wing, but they're dark in comparison to the very shiny part. Well, I mean, they're not that dark, but you can see the difference between the two parts. Now, at this stage, it's still, everything needs a bit more refining, but you can clearly see more where there's like all sort of random reflections going on. That, again, as I say, they're hard to know exactly where to put them, but the nice thing is they're not wrong however you decide to do it. So they are more, because there's no guide for it. It's not like there's any, you're reflecting a specific thing on the model. Now, if it was like, say, two parts, you were painting in a reflection depending on the angle of, say, his arm reflecting in the wing, and if you hold it at a certain angle, you could certainly do that as a reflection, but you'd only kind of look at it from that angle. then it would you'd have to be more specific on how you painted in that reflection. But when it's not something that's actually visible on the model, so it's just random reflections, you can paint them however you like. The only way you can go wrong is if it just looks bad. And it's very hard to describe what looks good and what looks bad. But generally what I do is I look for areas on the model that are kind of empty, and then or just need more detail, and then I fill them with these sort of random reflections. But just don't do that everywhere. Be selective with how you do it. You will want certain areas of blankness, because that will then make other areas look better in their complexity and detail. But I say areas of blankness, but I mean less detailed areas, like not unpainted. So remember, try and stay away from the flat Mournfang brown kind of look. You can just see on this the tips of the wings. So I'm going to have to spend more time on these at the moment, but I just wanted to get the very bulk of the wing done, because it's such an important part of this model, this wing. It's iconic in terms of it being the Emperor's Children symbol, anyway, like a Slaneshi sort of Emperor's Children symbol at this stage. But it's super important to get this right, and it's so visible on the model, right in the focus area of it. So it's definitely something, if you're going to spend time on the model, that you like, too much time if you like, this wing and the face are the areas that you have to go to town on. Like, if you make them as perfect as you can be less perfect in other areas. And it's definitely true that Forge World models will it's kind of like test your patience on trying to get everywhere on it like perfectly painted, because it just is not going to happen. It's there are too many. It's just not as fun painting a resin model as it is a plastic model. So you will be pulling your hair out. But if there's two areas on the model that you really need to spend the time on, it's the face and this wing. Everything else can be a little bit less perfect, if you like. So here's the wing at this stage, and you can see I've already painted in the central part on his chest with the gem one. So that's going to be the next video that I'm going to go on to straight away. But you can see how it's all coming together now, and how I've started painting in some edges as well on that top feather, and the edges really just help to define everything and sell it a bit more as a non-metallic metal, a non-metallic, or rather a metallic object painted in a non-metallic metal style. There you go. So, and you can see that I've painted in some orange reflections there, a few little more bits on the underside. But I've got to try and find a way to make the bottom part of this wing, because I don't want the bottom part of the wing any brighter than it is now, really. So maybe the odd little bit of shine spot, and that's probably the way that I'm going to get around it, because the top section, that's nice and shiny. I'm very happy with how that looks. The bottom section, you can see it's only like a couple of base colours, and it looks all right in the photo, but it doesn't look all right in the flesh, because they're very basic colours. Now I'm obviously going to blend them. Everything will be cleaned up from there, but it's still, I'll be adding little bits. That might be another separate video again, or part of, I think I'll probably do that as actually part of painting a shoulder pad or something, because there's lots of very fine details on the trim on the shoulder pads and all over the model, really. So they're all going to need like a special treatment to make them look sort of metallic and look good, while not making everything super bright. It is definitely a challenging model to do, because it's all sort of like tiny details and bits of trim and things. There's not really any clean element apart from on the arms a little bit. So I'm kind of looking forward to painting the arms, because they're just going to be smooth and clean, and with some like nice soft highlights, a bit similar to painting the face. And it just helps to have parts of the model that are just a bit smoother and like more fun to paint, because you're not racking your brain trying to figure out how to make it look like a metallic surface. But anyway, so that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to go and do the voiceover now for the gem, but I'll see you next time.